This day in sports history. Hey, and welcome back for another go-round of what happened on this day throughout sports history. I'm Steve White in the driver's seat of this here time machine, so let's get moving, starting with what happened on this day in 1975 when hockey legend Bobby Hull sat out a game in protest. A single-player protest is not that common. Usually it's a collective, fighting for more money or better working conditions, say. With Hull, it was about better working conditions, but not for him. Rather, he was protesting for a pair of his teammates. Prior to the mid-70s, there weren't very many European players in the National Hockey League. They were seen as soft. Hockey was a physical game, always has been and still is, and it was thought that you had to be able to hit and hit hard in order to survive in the league. Well, Bobby Hull had signed to play with the Winnipeg Jets of the World Hockey Association back in 1972. In 1974, the Jets brought in a pair of Swedish hockey players, Anders Hedberg and Ulf Nilsson. The duo was known as the Swedish Express, and impressed with their skating and their goal-scoring prowess. Hedberg scored 53 goals and assisted 47 in the first of 4 consecutive 100-point seasons in 1974. Nilsson netted 26 goals and assisted 94 others for the first of his 4 straight 100-point seasons as well. Now, those numbers drew a lot of attention, some good and some bad. While Hedberg and Nilsson were proving that European players could be an asset for North American hockey teams, they were also becoming targets of the goons of the WHA. They were taking harder than normal hits by guys who were intent on proving the Euro stereotype correct. Hull initiated his one-game protest with the league office after Perry Miller suffered a severe eye injury in a game against Cincinnati. Now, Perry was a Canadian, but Hull had seen enough directed at his European teammates that he wanted to call attention to it before one of those guys got injured unnecessarily. The following day, Hull held an emotional press conference where tears were shed in hopes that the league would do something to curtail the violence. So, did the protest do anything? Not really. The league didn't make any rule changes or issue any warnings to overly physical players. The NHL and WHA were rough places to play. Now, fortunately, Hedberg and Nilsson were good enough skaters and in good enough condition to avoid a lot of hits and extend their careers. Hedberg played a total of 11 seasons in the WHA and the NHL. Nilsson spent 8 years playing professionally in North America. Along with Hull, the trio formed the Hotline with the Winnipeg Jets, and they won a couple of AFCO Cups before going separate ways. And without a doubt, Hedberg and Nilsson changed the game. Their success proved the prevailing thought to be wrong and opened the door for more and more Europeans to play in the World Hockey Association and the National Hockey League. On this day in 1884, it was the first interleague championship played in professional baseball. You know it now as the World Series. And while that title was bounced around a bit about this series, the first officially recognized World Series was not until 1903. But just as Stanley and Livingstone searched for the source of the Nile, you can trace the Fall Classic, which begins tomorrow between LA and New York, back to this point 140 years ago. So this was the Providence Grays of the National League and the American Association representative New York Metropolitans playing the best-of-3 series. And it all came about when the manager of the Mets challenged the Grays manager to a showdown, with each team putting up $1,000 in a winner-take-all format. Game 1 was played on the 23rd, with Providence winning 6-0 behind the pitching of Charles Radford, nicknamed Old Hoss. Well, Old Hoss had reportedly won 60 games during the '84 season. Radbourne came back to pitch Game 2 on this day and baffled Mets hitters again in a 3-1 win for the Grays. Game 2 only went 7 innings before running out of daylight, and the temperature was a bit on the frigid side as well. So that was it. The Grays had won the series. But the two teams decided to play a third game, even though the series had already been decided. The Grays won that one as well in a 6-inning affair. The New York Clipper, which was a publication back then, named the series the Championship of the United States, while the Sporting Life called the Grays World Champions. And from that, we got the World Series. On this day in 1985, the Chicago Bulls acquired the Iceman, George Gervin, from San Antonio in a trade for David Greenwood. Gervin was not a big fan of this move. He'd been a Spur going back to their ABA days. He was a perennial all-star, he led the league in scoring on 4 different occasions, and he'd grown to love San Antonio. But it was fortuitous for the Bulls. Now, Greenwood had had some issues with Bulls management and held out at the start of the 1984 season. The trade on this day happened the day before the season started, but Gervin ended up playing in all 82 games. He started 77 of them, and he averaged 16 points a contest. But one of the big things is that he was able to pick up a lot of the scoring load after Michael Jordan went down with a broken foot in the 3rd game of this, his 2nd NBA season, and he missed 64 games. Gervin helped the Bulls backdoor their way into the playoffs with a 30-52 record. And without that, we would have never gotten to see Jordan's breakout 63-point performance against the Boston Celtics in their first-round playoff series. Gervin only spent 1 year as a Bull. He took his talents to Italy the next season and never played in the NBA again. On this day in 1999, what started out as a celebration of the Major League Baseball's all-century team turned into NBC reporter Jim Gray grilling Pete Rose like Tom Cruise did to Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men.
Did you order the Code Red?
Prior to Game 2 of the World Series in Atlanta, 30 of the greatest players in baseball history were selected to be honored, and all the ones who were still living at that time made it to the ballpark. For the first time in more than a decade, Pete Rose stepped onto a baseball field after being banned for life by Bart Giamatti. The capacity crowd at Turner Field that night gave Pete the loudest and the longest ovation. Gray was able to corral Pete for an interview, and after congratulating him on the All-Century Team honor, began to ask question after question after question about betting on baseball. Pete continued to deny any involvement in betting on baseball, but here's the thing. There is a time and a place, right? This was the first time that Rose had been on the field in a decade, and it was supposed to be a celebration of the greatest to ever play the game. Instead, it became all about Jim Gray trying to force Pete into a confession on live television. Why can't we just let Pete enjoy the moment, right? Well, after 3 questions, Pete had had enough, and he had this to say to Gray.
Yeah, I'm surprised you're bombarding me like this. I mean, I'm doing an interview with you on a great night, a great occasion, a great ovation. Everybody seems to be in a good mood, and you're bringing up something that happened 10 years ago.
Well, I bring it up because I think people would like to see you get it on. Pete, we got to go. We got a game.
Prosecutor's brief. It's not an interview, and I'm very surprised at you.
The reaction to Jim Gray's interview was mostly, if not universally, negative. The USA Today wrote, "It became the Jim Gray Show. Thanks to Gray's self-serving grandstanding in front of a national TV audience, he made himself part of the show." After the Yankees won Game 3 on a Chad Curtis home run, Gray grabbed Curtis for an interview, and this is what he had to say.
Chad, tell us about that pitch.
I can't do it. As a team, we kind of decided that, we because of what happened with Pete, we're not going to talk out here on the field. I do want to say that was for you, though, Grandma. Thanks.
Thousands upon thousands of complaints came into NBC about Gray's approach. Prior to Game 3 of the series, Gray did offer an apology, saying, "I thought it was important to ask Pete Rose if this was the right moment for him to make an apology. If in doing so the interview went on too long and took some of the joy of the occasion, then I want to say to baseball fans everywhere that I am very sorry about this." And time now for today's nothing to do with sports fun fact. Decades before he became the president, Gerald Ford worked as a model and was actually on the cover of Cosmopolitan. He was fully clothed in his Navy uniform, and the issue was published in 1942. That's all for today. I'll see you back here tomorrow for another edition of This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.